Welcome back, everybody. We are continuing with this course on basics of biblical Hebrew with Louis Dizon. Louis, welcome back. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Been pretty busy on my end, but glad to be able to still make time to do these sessions. And, excited about the fact that we are nearing the halfway mark when it comes to these lessons. So, I think people who have been able to follow along this far, they've already learned a good deal. And actually, at the end of this session, we'll have learned all the various verb forms for the kal stem. And then the next few lessons after this, we'll be dealing with the other stems. So, it's great.
Yeah. Well, go ahead and take it away. Did you also have a PowerPoint that you wanted to share, or verbum that you wanted to add on the
Yeah,
screen?
I'm gonna use verbum
Okay.
for this. Also, you may recall for the past couple of sessions we started doing a thing where we include a song for these, but unfortunately for copyright purposes, we're not able to actually play them. So instead, uh, we will give you the link in the show description. So for those who are for this session song, it's called Bashana Haba'a, which literally means next year. It's actually a pretty modern Hebrew song. It was written in 1970 by an Israeli writer by named Ehud Manor, and it's a fairly simple Hebrew, and I highly recommend listening to it for anybody who wants to learn Hebrew via song.
Mhm.
Yeah. And now with that out of the way, um, we will head to the grammar lesson, and then after that, we'll do continuation with translation. You may recall we've been translating sections of simplified versions of the Joseph story from Genesis, and we got up to chapter 43, and then this session we'll do chapter 44. So to begin with, we're gonna do the grammar lesson for this session is on the kal vav consecutive. Now, this is not a new form for those of you who have um, been doing translation work already. You've already seen this form. Whenever you see a vayhi or vayomer, that's an example of the kal vav consecutive. But we didn't have a lesson specifically dedicated to it yet. So, chapter 17 of the textbook is on the topic of kal vav consecutives. So this will help to um, build up your knowledge of what that is precisely and what are the different meanings that it could take. Um, there are two forms of the kal vav consecutive. There's what you call the kal vav consecutive imperfect and the vav consecutive perfect. Um, But the other term that you will sometimes hear would be the Vayiktal and the Vaish and the Vakatal forms. In fact, in certain other Hebrew grammars, those are the preferred terms. Um, you're going to hear me use both interchangeably. So, for example, here, the Hebrew Bible insert, which I'm using as a supplement for these lessons, uses Vaiktol as the preferred term for this type of form. Um, so what is the Vaiktol or the Vav consecutive imperfect? So it's basically you take the imperfect form of the verb and then you add the a Vav and a Patach, and then a Dagesh on the first letter of the word, like this. So this is different from a simple conjunction imperfect. So Yishmor is the example here. So he will keep, that's the basic imperfect form. If you add a conjunction to it, it will become a simple conjunction imperfect. That's Vishmor, and he will keep. And then if you add the Vav consecutive, it becomes vayishmor. Notice that the meaning changes. It's no longer will keep, but it's kept, and he kept. Um, and this can be a little bit disorienting for people encountering it for the first time. So it essentially is translated the opposite of an actual imperfect verb here. And as the textbook explains it, despite the similarity in form between the imperfect and the verb consecutive imperfect, the latter seems to be a distinct conjugation devoted to conveying past tense. It serves as the standard verb form for past tense narrative. So, past tense narrative here refers to narrative books that take place at some point in the past. So, most of the historical books of the Old Testament, for example, are what you call a past tense narrative. Now, because it's not truly related to the imperfect, it is in fact a past tense conjugation. Modern scholars prefer to use the term preterite to describe these verbs. So that's another word you'll sometimes hear, preterite. So you can call it a bunch of different things. You can call it a verb consecutive imperfect, you can call it a preterite, or you can call it a Viktor. And we'll use those terms more or less interchangeably. I'm going to avoid using the term preterite though. Stick to either verb consecutive imperfect or Viktor. So how do you identify it? As explained, you have the vav patach and then a dagesh on the letter right above after that, like this. Viktor. That's the term. Now, there are a few. So the verb consecutive imperfect often mirrors the form of the imperfect, as we've seen. However, this is not always the case. Sometimes it will take a form that is historically shorter than the imperfect. And in these situations, it'll look a little bit more like ajussive. Um, and there are some examples given here. So the verb consecutive imperfect for the verb seem would be vayasem. Um, Notice that there is a segal underneath the scene here. Contrast this with the imperfect form yasim. Instead of the segal, you have a hirek and a yod. Um, and this is an example of how the Viktor form is different from the imperfect form. And here we have a chart, a handy little chart showing you the differences. First column shows you all the imperfect forms, whereas the second column shows you the jussive forms, and then the third column shows you the verb consecutive imperfects. Hold on just a sec. I need to turn off an app in the background. Yeah. Oh, won't let me do it. Never mind. Um, so notice that in places where the imperfect and adjussive form are different from each other, the verb consecutive tends to be more similar to the adjussive form, as you can see here. Um, so that is the case for the first person singular as well as the first person plural. So you have ektol for the imperfect, ektala for the adjussive, and then in the verb consecutive here, you can have actually either form, vectol or vectala, and then niktol for the plural, niktala for the adjussive, and then the vectol form can be either vaniktol or vaniktala. Um, there's a few other notable examples where the Viktor form is different from the imperfect form. So haya is a great example of that. The imperfect would be yihye, so yod he. Whereas the Viktor form of that would be vayahi. So it's a vav, yod, he, and then yod. you may recall running into that form already in our grammar exercises. So that's, you know for sure that that is a that's a Victol form, because the imperfect form will never use yahi. It will be yihye. Um, so whenever there is a short and a long form, um, the Vav consecutive perfect will exhibit the short form, as explained here. Now, that being said, the Vav consecutive imperfect um, is a true past tense verb form. So whenever you see it, it's referring to something that has already occurred. It could be something that is in the near past, or it could be something in the more distant past. Um, and whenever the Vav consecutive imperfect is used, it's always the first word in the clause. So um, let me pull up the Hebrew Bible really quickly to show you. Let's just use Genesis 1 as an example. So really quickly, here are all of the Victol forms that occur in the first 5 verses. Notice that in all of these cases, the Victol is the first word in the clause that it appears in. Contrast that with verse 2, where it says, V'ha'aretz haita tohu vavohu. So notice that the first word in the clause is ha'aretz, which of course is a noun, not a verb. And because of that, the first verb in this clause cannot be a Victol. Instead, you have a simple perfect form, haita, contrast with vaihi in this case. And this is because it's the second word in the clause, and as the second word in the clause, it can never be a Victol. If the author of Genesis wanted to use the Victol form in verse 2, it would be something along the lines of V'tehi haaretz. For whatever reason, it's not phrased that way. Instead, haaretz is the first word in this clause. The same applies whenever the word lo is used. Once you put lo at the beginning of a clause, then the verb becomes the second word in the clause, and therefore it cannot be a Victol. So here is a more in-depth look at Genesis 1, verses 1 to 5. So notice all of the Victol forms: Vayomer, Vayhi, Vayar, Vayavdel, Vaikra, and then Vayhi again. These are all, every time it's used, it's to signal that a new clause is beginning. However, there are some clauses where the verb is not at the beginning of the clause, and as a result, it does not take a Victol form. So, for example, V'lachoshek karalayla. The word for to call is the second in the clause, therefore, it cannot be Vaikra, it has to be Kara. If it was in the beginning of the clause, you could say Vaikra Hachoshek, but that wouldn't Lachoshek Laila. So a few more examples we'll see in the Hebrew Bible insert shown here. So usually a series of Victols are used to narrate a sequence of past events. So each word that occurs here is one right after another. So in Ruth chapter 2, verse 3, it says, Vatelech, Vatavo, Vatlakesh, Basade. So, and she left, and she went, and she gleaned in the field. So each of these actions comes right after another. 1 Kings 18, verse 38, shows us a similar construction. Vatipol esh Adonai vatochal et haolah. And the fire of the Lord fell, and it consumed the burnt offering. So first it fell and then it consumed. Now, at the beginning of a narrative, Viktor could sometimes be modified by a preceding circumstantial clause, and that's usually introduced by the word Vaihi, which you may recognize as the Viktor form of Haya. Some examples of this would be 2 Samuel um, chapter 10, verse 1, Acharechen, Vayamot Melech, Vayhi Bnei Ammon. I think hold on. Yep. So after this, the king died, and he was of the sons of Ammon. So the syntax is a little bit funky here. The king of the Ammonites died, if you want to render it idiomatically. But here it says just, and the king died, and he was of the sons of Ammon. So that's actually two separate clauses, which in the English translation has been combined to one clause for simplicity. In Genesis 22, verse 4, we have Bayom Hashlishi Vayisa Abraham et Enav. So on the third day, Abraham looked up. Okay. However, literally, it'd be on the third day, and Abraham lifted up his eyes. It's not always strictly, Viktols are not always strictly sequential. There are a number of times where a Viktol is referring back to an event that is actually previous to the one right before it. So as explained here, Viktol may refer to a previous event. This is a past perfect or a pluperfect. It's either explicit or by inference from context. There's, for example, Exodus 4:19, Vayomer Adonai El Moshe. So when the Lord had said to Moses, so Lord didn't say to Moses right at that point, but it's referring back to a previous time when the Lord had said this to Moses. Genesis 29, verse 24, it says, Vaiten Lavan la et Zilpa shifchato lal et leleah bito shifcha. Now, Laban had given Zilpah, his maid, to be his daughter Leah's maid. This is something that didn't happen right at that point, but had happened at some point in the unspecified past, and the author is inserting it at this point in order to explain that this is the case. Joshua chapter 7, verse 1. Vayim alu b'nei Yisrael, vaikach achan. So the Israelites had acted perversely, and Achan had taken something. Now we know how the rest of that story goes if you go back to the story of Achan in Joshua 7, or Achan. This is something that happened prior to the events in the sequence. Another example of this, not included in the book we're reading through, is Genesis 2:19. I actually recently wrote an article on this. Vayitzer Adonai Elohim min ha'adama kol chayat hasadeh ve'et kol of hashmayim. And now out of the ground the Lord had formed every beast of field and every bird of the heavens. And then Vayave el ha'adam lir'ot ma yikra lo v'chol asher yikra lo ha'adam nefesh chaya hu shmo. And brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever man called every living creature, that was its name. So does this come right after verse 18? If this was understood as purely sequential, then one would be tempted to interpret that way, that this happens right after God said in verse 18, it's not good for man to be alone. However, we know in Genesis 1, verses 20 onwards, that these living creatures have already been created prior to creation of man. And if we understood this sequentially, this would create a contradiction. So a number of commentators have noted that this is a non-sequential use of the Vaiktol form. Vaitzer here is being used as a pluperfect. It's referring back to something that happened way, way back, which is that God had created all the other animals. Finally, There is what is called the epexegetical use of the Viktor, which is basically a Viktor that refers back to a previous um, event, a previous Viktor, and it's explaining it or rephrasing it. So in Ruth 2 verse 3, it talks about Ruth did not set out to glean in Boaz's field. And in verse 4, it says, Vaiker mikrea chelchat hasadeh levoaz. Um, Now, by chance, she had come to the portion of the field that belonged to Boaz. Um, and this is happening not sequentially, but simultaneously with the preceding verse. So these are the various ways that the Vaiktol can be used. Now, we're going to talk about the other form of the Vav consecutive, and that's the Vav consecutive perfect, or as it is called in other grammars, the Vikatal form, which already tells you what form this takes. So, um, there is so as it is, as the name suggests, it is similar in form to the perfect form. So we'll take Shamar as the basic form here. Shamar, Shamra, Shamru. And if you added the simple conjunction to it, it becomes Vishamar, Vishamra, and Vishamru. And he kept, she kept, they kept. But if it was a Vav consecutive imperfect, it would be will keep. And here's where it gets a little bit confusing because as you can see from this chart, the Vav consecutive perfect and the simple conjunction perfect look the same. It's not like with the other one where there's a change in the vowels. Here you can see that there is no change in the vowels. So in order to tell that the Vakatal form is in view, you would have to look at the context. So the Vav consecutive perfect is a true consecutive verb, unlike the Viktal form that we were just looking at. It is a true past tense and does not need another verb to establish the tense. The Vav consecutive perfect requires an initial verb to introduce the present future frame of the dialogue. So you have to know from something preceding it to know that the Vasham Vakatal is form is in view. Um, so it is dependent, as you can see. And the verb preceding it doesn't necessarily have to be an imperfect. It could be a volitional. So um, here it mentions that the imperative form can be used um, for as the leading verb to establish the future time frame. If you look at Deuteronomy 6:49, this is a good example of this. This is the famous Shema Yisrael, and so called because the first word there is Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And the next verse it says, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol me'odecha. Notice the word ve'ahavta. That is the katal form. You will love the Lord your God. It is a command, but it is being phrased with a vekatal rather than an imperative. And then you see more examples of that as you go down the list. V'hayu hadevarim ha'ele asher anochi metzavcha hayom al levavecha. And the words will be, and these words will be, which I've commanded you upon your heart. And then Vashinantam levanecha, you will teach them to your children. Vadibarta bam, and you will speak about them. And skipping this. Vakashartam laor al yadecha, you will bind them as signs upon your hand. Letotafot ben enecha, and between your hands, v'chayu ve'u ketavtam, and you will write them. upon the mezuzot of your house, upon the doorpost of your house, uvish arecha, and upon your gates. Every vikatal in the Shema is expressing a command, but doing it in a non-imperatival way. Instead, they decide to use what would normally be considered an indicative form. And you will do this, um, roughly speaking. So, as it so you can see that in order to tell if the katal is in view, you need to rely on context. So context is the primary means of distinguishing between verb consecutive perfects and simple conjunction imperfects. However, there are some cases where there is a distinct form for the vav consecutive perfect. So the vekatal sometimes shifts the accent. And you can see that in this chart right here, second masculine singular, that would be, um, it would be this one, as well as the first person singular, and the first person plural. So in the simple imperfect, you would have katalti, um, whereas in the verb consecutive perfect, it would be ve katalti. Um, actually, um, that one not actually. So if it was, yeah. So you can see here. Actually, it's both on the second radical, so I don't know why it's listed as the. Okay, so actually it has to do with the fact that the accent shifts to the final syllable. This must be a typo. It should be katalta rather than katalta. Um, you can see it more clearly actually in these other two forms. Um, Vakatalti for the simple imperfect, vakatalti for verb consecutive. Notice that the little arrow moves from the tet to the tav here for the vakatal. Same here. So for the plural form, vakatalna for the simple imperfect, vakatalna for the vakatal. The the accent marker moves to the nun right here. Um, so if you notice that the accent marker has been moved to the last syllable, then that's a good clue to tell you that you have a vakatal on your hands. Um, and this is what I already explained earlier. Vaihi rather than is an irregular form for the vekatal, or sorry, the vaiktol form of haya rather than yihye. Um, that's There are other examples, but this is the most common one that you'll run into. Um, let's look at a few other examples of the vekatal here. So Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 to 8. Lachen emor livnei Israel ani Adonai hotzeti והצלתי אתכם אתכם וגאלתי אתכם ולקחתי והייתי וידעתם והבאתי ונתתי אותם. So there's a bunch of words that have been removed, placed in ellipses here. But you'll notice that this is the Lord. He is saying he will do a bunch of things for Israel. I will bring you out, hotseti, and then I will deliver you, salti, and I will redeem you, vagaalti, and I'll take you, vilakachti, saying that these are all things that God is going to do for them in the future, and He's going to do them one after another. The vakatal can also be used in procedural texts, saying these are the things you have to do one after the other. Think of it like an instruction manual. Step 1, step 2, step 3. One example of that is in Ruth 3, verse 3. Varachatst vesakt Vashamt simlotaich alaich vayarad hagoren tiv al tivadi laish ad kaloto leechol velishtot. So wash and anoint yourself and put on your garment and then go down to the threshing floor. So Naomi is telling Ruth to do these four things one after the other. Um, Now, you may have some texts where some instructions are given and then they're followed. When the instructions are given, they're in the Vikatal, and then when they're followed, the narrative shifts to Viktal. So, in the instructions for the tabernacle in Exodus 26, you have a great example of this. Va'asita chamishim karseh zahav. Make 50 gold clasps. Ve hibarta et ha-yariot. And then join the curtains. V'haya hamishkan echad. And it will be one dwelling. Chapter 36, the instructions are carried out. Vayas chamishim karseh zahav. And he made 50 gold clasps. Vayichaber, and then he joined them. Vayichaber et yariot. Vahi hamishkan echad. And it was one dwelling. So then there's a couple more examples here. So these are different. So we'll skip those ones. Actually, one more thing that wasn't covered in the textbook, but it's worth mentioning, is something called the prophetic perfect. So sometimes so we mentioned that the Viktal form in past narratives refers to a past action. I want to make note of the fact that if you are dealing with a prophetic text, this rule does not apply, because in a prophetic text, the Viktal can be used for future events. Actually, these are actually not Viktal forms. Let me find a good example of it. Because in prophetic text, sometimes the Viktal and the Vikatal are used differently from how they're used in a historical text. Can't find a good example right now, so we'll skip that for now. So this will be all of the forms that you'll encounter for the for the call stem. So you know how the Vav consecutive works now. You've run into it already. Now you have a fuller idea of how it functions. If you look at the chapters we have just covered, we've learned the perfect, the imperfect, the volitional, participle, infinitives, and the Vav consecutives. And these are all for the call stem. I just want to make note of that. Up to this point, we've only been working with one type of binyan in the Hebrew. There are multiple binyanim. You have the nifal, the piel, the pual, hitpael, the hifil, and the hofal. Those will be covered in subsequent chapters. And besides that, there are a few rarer forms that you'll very seldom ever run into. There's, for example, the hitpalel form, which only ever gets used maybe 2 or 3 times throughout the Hebrew Bible. These are the binyanim that you need to learn, because they're the ones that occur relatively frequently in Hebrew. Actually, there is a chapter for rare verb stems, so we'll cover them, even if only briefly. So we'll do the nifal for the next grammar, and then after that, and then for now, we're going to move on to do the translation exercises. You recall, we did up to Genesis 43. Um, where we last left off, the brothers had returned to Egypt with Benjamin, and Joseph is still in disguise. They don't know who he is. And now we're going to cover chapter 44, Joseph Friends to Enslave Benjamin. Um, in order to make things run faster, I'm gonna do away with um, parsing the verbs. I'll just give you the simple translation. When you're doing, I'll leave it to you when you're doing these translations on your own to do your own parsing. However, when you hear me do the translation, it'll give you an idea of how each verb is being used. All right, so verse 1. Vayomer el ha'ish hashomer al beto lemor. Sim ochel basakehem vasim kesef ish bepi sako. And he said to the man who was guarding the house, saying, place food in their sack and place money, uh, place the money of each man, place the money of each in the mouth of the sack. Verse 2. Ve'et kosi kos hakesef tasim bepi sak hakaton ve'et kesef le lachmo ve'as kidvar Yosef asher diber. And my cup, the cup of silver, you will place in the mouth of the sack. Notice that the indicative is being used in an imperatival sense here. You'll place in the mouth of the sack, the small sack, the smallest sack rather, and the silver, lachmo, and the silver, and then you will do according to the word of Joseph, which he spoke. And he did according to the word of Joseph as he spoke. So Joseph asked the chief guard, the guard of the house, to put the silver cup in the smallest sack, the one that's going to be Benjamin's rather. Verse 3, Vayhi baboker, ve'anashim halhu hema ve'chamorehem. And so it was in the morning, and the men walked, they and their donkeys. Verse 4, Hem yotzim et ha'ir va'en rachokim hem vayosef amar la'asher al beto kum rdof acharei ha'anashim ve'amarta alehem lama asitem ra'a tachat tova lignov et kos adoni. So here's where Joseph dispatches his guard. And they were going out of the city, and they were not yet far. And they were not yet far. And then Joseph said to the man who was upon his house, arise, pursue after the men, and you will say and say to them, why have you done evil instead of good, to steal the cup of my Lord? Notice, by the way, that all the different forms of the verb are present in these past few verses. You've got the vitals, you've got the participles, you've got the infinitives. Even though I'm not parsing them, you can see that all these different forms are being used now. And you also have some imperatives to boot. So you're getting a good sampling of verb forms here. Verse 5. Halo ze asher yishte adoni bo vehu yinachesh bo atem asitem ra B. Gnavchem oto? Is this not which? Is it not this which my Lord drinks in it, and he does divination in it? So Yinachesh is do divination. Notice that it's very similar to the word for snake. Um, Hebrew has some interesting little things like that. You have done evil in stealing from him, in your stealing from him. And then verse 6, Vayirdof acharehem, Vayidaber alehem et hadivarim ha'ele. And he pursued after them, and he spoke to them these words, rather. Verse 7, Vayomer elav, Lama yedaber Adoni ka dvarim ha'ele, Chalila le'avadecha mignov et hakos hazeh. And they said to him, so the brothers are replying back to the guard, why does he speak? Why does my Lord speak such words, such these words? Far be it from your servants from stealing, or that they should steal this cup. They're denying that this is something they did. They're not aware that the cup is in their sack. Note. Verse 8, Hen kesef asher matzanu b'fi sakenu natanu elecha ve'ech nignov mibet adonecha kesef o zahav. So behold, this is a short form of the word hine, as indicated here. Behold, the silver which we found in the mouth of our sacks, we gave to you. And how would we steal from the house of your Lord silver or gold? They're saying, how could you say these things about us? We returned the money the first time around. We're not the sort of person who would do these kinds of things. And then verse 9, Asher timtza et hakos ito me avadeha yamut v'gam anachnu nihye la'adoni la'avadim. And just because they're that confident that they're innocent, they would say, he whom you found the cup with him from among your servants, may he die, or may he be put to death. This is from Mut. And also we will be to my Lord servants. So saying, if you find the cup with us, the guy with it is going to die, and the rest of us will be your slaves or servants. In verse 10, Vayomer, Gam ata ki dvarechem chen hu emtza et hakos ito yihye li aved ve'ata tihyu nakim. And he said also, now, as your words thus it'll be, I will find the cup with him, he will be to me a servant or a slave, and you will go and you will arise, or rather you will go free. Say, the only person who's going to be made a slave is the one with the cup. The rest of you could go away free. Verse 11, Vayasimu ish et sako arza vayiftahu otam. And they placed, each man placed his sack to the groundwards rather, and they opened them. They opened the sacks. And in verse 12, V'yivakesh me hagadol v'ad hakaton v'yimatze et hakos b'sak binyamin. So he sought from the greatest until the smallest, and he found the cup in the sack of Benjamin, right where it was placed in the very beginning. Verse 13, Vayhi v'matz'o et hakos vayikra'u bigdehem vayiamos ish et sako al chamoro vayashuvu ha'ira. And so it was, when he found the cup, and they cried out um, in their distress, um, and to load and they loaded each his sack upon his donkey. um, Actually, they tore their clothes. Sorry, I mistranslated this. They tore their clothes, and then each man loaded his sack upon his donkey, and they returned to the city. So instead of going back to their homeland, they went to the city along with the palace official, um, to plead with Joseph. In verse 14, Vayavo Yehuda ve'echav beta Yosef v'hu odenu sham vayiplu lefanav atza. And Judah went along with his brothers to the house of Joseph, and he was, he was then he was again there, and they went before him there, and they fell before him to the ground. Yeah, so they're pleading with him not to take Benjamin away here. Verse 15, Vayomer lahem Yosef ma hamaaseh hazeh asher asitem halo yadatem ki yinachesh ish asher kamoni. And Joseph said to them, What is this deed which you've done? Do you not know that I do divination, that I am a man who does divination, like that a man does divination, rather. So it's a little funky syntax here. So he's saying, I'm able to tell what the future is using this cup. And then in verse 16, it's a very long verse, 3 lines here. Vayomer Yehuda, ma nomar la'adoni, ma nedaber v'nihye v'nikim ha'elohim matzah et avon avadecha, hinenu avadim la'adoni gam anachnu gam asher matzata et hakos beyado. And Judah said, what we have said to my Lord, what we have spoken, and we will be standing up. And the Lord found the iniquity of your servant. So this is referring back to what happened in Genesis 37 when the brothers sold Egypt to slavery. They recognize that they are being recompensed for that. The Lord has found the iniquity of your servant. Behold, we, your servants, to my master, we also, you have found the cup in his hand. So they're saying they weren't expecting to have the cup found in their possession, but there it is. And then verse 17, Vayomer Chalilali me asot zot haish asher matzati et hakos biyado hu yihye li aved ve'ata alu l'shalom et avichem. So Joseph saying that only the guilty person will be enslaved. And he said, "Far be it from me to do this. The man with whom I'm found the cup in his hand, he will be to me a slave." Um, and go you go up in peace to your father. So the brothers all said that they would all be slaves collectively, but Joseph said, no, only Benjamin will be the slave here. And then in verse 18, Vayidaber elav Yehuda, Vayomer bi Adoni, Yidaberna Avdecha Devar Be'ozne Adoni, Va'al Yikar Afcha Be'avdecha Ki Kmocha Be'paro. Um, so he said to them, Judah said to him, rather, and he said, please, my lord, Idaberna Abdecha, he will speak to your servant. He said in the ears of my lord, and do not be angry. So yichar af, idiomatically it's to be angry. Literally it's, may your face not grow hot. Do not be angry with your servant, for you are just like Pharaoh. They're recognizing that he has Pharaoh's authority here. Verse 19, Adoni sha'al et avadav hayesh lachem av o ach. So my Lord asked his servants if you have a father or brother. And in verse 20, Vahi bish'alcha otanu vanomer el Adoni yesh lanu av zaken v'ach katon achiv enenu vehu yesh levado le'imo ve'aviv ohev oto. And so it was when you asked us, and we said to my Lord that we have an old father and a brother, a small brother, and our brother and his brother is no longer with him, referring to Joseph, and he is alone. He is the only son left to his mother, and his father loves him, or his father's loving him. This is participle form, as you can recognize. Verse 21. Verse 21. Vatomer el avadecha yavo elai va'asima eni alav. And you said to your servants, he shall come to me, and I will set my eye upon him. So referring to the command to bring the younger brother back. And then verse 22, Vanomer el Adoni, lo yuchal hanaar la'azov et aviv va'azav et aviv v'met. And we said to my Lord, the young man is not able to leave his father. Notice the infinitive construct here. And if he leaves his father, he will die. So saying that the father will die of grief if Benjamin leaves him. In verse 23, Vatomer el avadecha, im lo yared achichem hakaton itchem lo tuchlu lirot panai. And you said to your servants, if he does not come down, if your old, that is to say, your youngest brother does not come down with you, you will not be able to see my face. This is referring back to a few chapters ago. Verse 24, Vahiki alinu el avdecha avi va nesaper lo et divrei Adoni. And so it was when we went up to your servant, my father, and we recounted to him the words of my Lord. Verse 25, Vayomer Avinu, Shuvu, Shivru lanu ma'at okel. So this is when they go back. So our father said, return, buy for us a little bread. And then verse 26, Vanomer lo nuchal ochel im yesh achinu hakaton itanu va yaradnu ki lo nuchal lirot pnei haish ve'achinu hakaton enenu itanu. And we said we are not able to buy food unless our brother, our youngest brother, is with us. So yeah, that's why he had to come down with them. And we went down when we were not able to see the face of the man, and our brother, our youngest brother, is not with us. So they're saying we can't go back to our father without Benjamin. They explained that he is Jacob's favorite now that Joseph's no longer around. In verse 27, Vayomer avdecha avi elenu atem yadatem ki shnaim yalda li ishti rather. And he said, your servant, my father, to us, you know if you know when 2 were born to me, my wife. So it's saying that the wife, Jacob's wife, Rachel, actually begat 2 children. And then verse 28, it says, Vayetse ha'echad me'iti va'omar ach met v'lo ra'iti oto ad ata. And he went out, the one went out from me, and I said, surely he has died, and I will not see him until now. And then verse 29, Ve'ulachachtem gam et ze me'im panai v'kara oto ason v'yaradti be'yagon shola. And you also took this from my face. And he called him Ason. Forgot what that word means. I'm gonna cheat here. Genesis 44:29. Yeah, if you take this one from me, harm befalls him. Okay, so ason means harm. Sorry, I forgot what that word means. So if you take also this one from my face, and harm falls upon him, yeah, and harm happens to him, and I will go down in grief to Sheol. So saying he's gonna die without Benjamin here. And then verse 30, Ve'ata ke vo'i el avdecha avi ve'hana'ar enenu itanu ve'nafsho kashura b'nafsho. And now, as I went out to your servant, my father, and the young man is not with us. So if we return to our father and the young man is not with us, and his life, kshura b'nafsho, his life is bound up with the lad's life. So kashura, passive participle from kashar, his soul is bound up with his soul. Verse 31, let me see, there's 4 more verses and then we'll be done with this translation. Verse 31, Vehaya ki ro'oto, and so ki en hanar vamet vayarad avdecha avenu biyagon sho'ola. And so it will be. This is a katal now. When he sees that there is no young man, he sees that Benjamin's not with them anymore, and he will die, and your servant, our father, will go down in grief to Sheol. Verse 32, Ki avdeka ara et hana'ar me'im avi lemor im lo yavo elecha vechatati le'avi kol hayamim. For your servant, Arav, let me see, became surety. For your servant became surety for the young man from with my father, before my father, saying, if I do not come to you, I have sinned against my father all my days. So they made a pledge that they would bring Benjamin back, and if not, they would be guilty of sin for not bringing him back here. Verse 33, Ve'ata yeshevna avdecha tachat hana'ar eved la'adoni ve'hana'ar ya'al im echav. And now, let him sit, let your servant dwell instead of the young man as a slave to your to my lord. So he's offering himself in place of Benjamin here. And the young man, let him go up with his brothers. So let him go, in other words. Ya'al means to go up here from Allah. And verse 34, finally, Ki ech ele el avi vehana'ar enenu iti pen er'e vara asher yimtza et avi. For how can I go up to my father, and the young man is not with us? lest I see in evil which he found my father. Or let me see, how is that translated here? I fear to see the evil that would come upon my father. So, lest I will see the evil which will be found with my father. Sometimes the syntax of the Hebrew can be a little bit confusing, and you may want to see how an existing translation renders it to see how it could be rendered more idiomatically. So, this is a good example of that. So, he's afraid that if he goes back to Jacob and Benjamin's not with him, that this would be, um, this would lead his father to basically die. So, now that that is done, um, the next chapter will be Joseph revealing himself to his brothers, which we'll cover next session when we will also be covering the Nephal stem. And that is the lesson for today.
Louis, I appreciate you so much doing this. Tell us a little bit more about the next one.
Yeah, so the next one will be on the Nephal stem. So this is the one that covers passive, the passive meanings of verbs. So um, whenever you see a Nephal in the text, basically refers to the subject being acted upon by another thing, um, and that's one of the other common stems that we're gonna encounter often.
Excellent. And once again, thank you so much, Louis. And patrons, thank y'all for watching. Members of the channel, thank y'all as well for your support. And I hope y'all are edified by this. Louis, we'll see you soon. And everybody else, y'all take care. God bless. Bye bye.